Hello, class. I'm back. This is lecture 16 for History 101. We just left off with the XYZ affair, which heightened tensions between the Federalists and Democratic Republicans. So, what the Federalists are going to do in response to these attacks on President Adams and Secretary of State Marshall by Democratic Republicans is they're going to pass a couple of laws. The names of these laws that are going to be passed in 1798, the following year, are the Alien and Sedition Acts. Now, these two laws are basically passed to suppress future members of the Democratic Republicans from joining and to sort of officially shut them up. So, let me explain to you these laws separately, because they are two separate laws, and then we'll talk about the implications of them and the aftermath. The Alien Act, basically what it does is it increases the time that it took to become a U.S. citizen after you moved here or immigrated here from 5 years to 14 years. So the way it worked before the Alien Act, if you immigrated to the United States, lived here 5 years, you could apply for citizenship and you're an American citizen. Now there's a 14-year waiting period. Reason why they do this? The Federalists who passed this law, they have a majority in both houses and a Federalist president, John Adams, is the overwhelming majority of immigrants coming to the United States are Irish. Now, we know back to the days of Sir Humphrey Gilbert and the Lane of Heads, the Irish hate the British. So, when the Irish come to the United States, gain citizenship, and are going to join a political party, it's pretty simple for them to figure out what party they're joining. Which party is anti-British? That party, as it emerges, is the Democratic Republicans. They're pro-French, anti-British. So, all the Irish immigrants are joining the Democratic Republican Party, which means they're gaining in strength, and sooner or later, they'll be the majority. So the Federalists are just delaying this, making it from 5 to 14 years before you can become a citizen and thus vote for Democratic Republicans. There's also part of this piece of legislation that says, during a time of war, the president, through executive order, can deport all aliens with the stroke of the pen. So if a war broke out, and the war was between the United States and France, which, thanks to the XYZ affair, was a possibility, President Adams could deport all these Irish immigrants, thus even further delaying them becoming citizens and Democratic Republicans. This is purely political. There's no concerns about immigration and too many people living in the United States or anything like that back in 1798. Now, for the Sedition Act, this basically made it a form of criminal libel to criticize the United States government, the president, or any part of it. And if you were caught speaking falsely, scandalously, or maliciously about the government or the president, you could receive up to 10 years in a federal prison and up to a $2,000 fine, which was a small fortune back then. So, while this law, which basically is the Federalists shutting up the opposition, the Democratic Republicans, from criticizing the president and other Federalists. During the course of this being in place for the next couple years, there will be 15 people indicted of violating this act and 10 actual convictions. Now, one example of sort of a ridiculous conviction, to show you how stupid this law was, there were a couple of guys that were at a dedication of a fort being opened. I don't remember where the fort was, but they were in the crowd, and the keynote speaker in the dedication of this brand new American fort was President Adams. So after Adams' speech, as a tradition, they're going to fire off a 21 cannon salute to the president. Now, when you're firing off cannons for these ceremonial purposes, obviously you don't put cannonballs in them and fire a cannonball unnecessarily out of a cannon, because who knows what it's going to hit. You just put a lot of gunpowder in it and a bunch of packing wad, which is, really just raw cotton, on top of that gunpowder and touch it off. And then typically the only thing that flies out of it is some of this packing wad. So one of these gentlemen said to his friend, and they're both obviously Democratic Republicans, after listening to Adams' speech, which they weren't very thrilled about, the one guy says to the other, "I hope some of the packing wad from one of those cannon hits Adams in his fat ass." A Federalist overheard that comment. The two of them were arrested. They were tried and convicted for violating the Sedition Act, and they were both given $100 fines, which is a significant amount of money back in 1798. Now, the most high-profile conviction of anybody with the Sedition Act was a congressman by the name of Matt Lyon. Now, there's a cartoon depiction of Lyon on page 202 where your textbook talks about this nonsense. Matt Lyon routinely criticized the Adams administration and Federalists on the floor of Congress. He was a congressman from the state of Vermont. He had been an Irish immigrant. He gained his citizenship, ended up running for Congress in Vermont, was elected, and he was a big critic of the Adams administration. Finally, the Federalists had their fill, and Lyon will be arrested for violating the Sedition Act. He'll be tried and convicted, and for his supposed crime, he will receive a 4-month prison term and a $1,000 fine. Now, Matt Lyon will obviously appeal this conviction. It'll end up being appealed all the way to the United States Supreme Court. The court will basically refuse to hear the case. They'll use, what's known in Latin in courts, the term stare decisis. I don't expect you to know that, but what it means is stare decisis, when the Supreme Court rules it, means the lower court decision holds. The lower court, the federal appeals court, refused to grant him his appeal and upheld the conviction. So the Supreme Court's basically saying, we agree with that decision, so we're not even hearing the case. They have the choice to do that. Now, the one thing behind all this that you have to realize, every single judge in the federal system, from federal district courts to the U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals up to the Supreme Court, is a Federalist. All we've had up to this point in history is Federalist presidents. 2 terms of George Washington and the term of John Adams. So they're appointing all Federalists to the courts. So, of course, they're going to rule against the Democratic Republicans. So, Matt Lyons has to serve his term in jail. Coincidentally, he's sitting in a federal prison cell in November of an election year. He runs his campaign anyway, and the voters of Vermont re-elect him even though he's in prison, and the minute he's released, he returns to Congress. And part of the problem that Lyons faced was he didn't have $1,000 to pay this fine. So potentially he might have had to sit in jail longer. Democratic Republicans from all across the country protesting the Sedition Act and this conviction of Matt Lyons will send him money, and they will pay the $1,000 fine in his behalf. So that's the most, publicized conviction of the 10 convictions, and it shows how ridiculous it all is. Now, the Democratic Republicans have to respond to this. Since the courts won't rule on this case. And obviously, had the Supreme Court done their job, they'd have heard this case and they'd have ruled it unconstitutional, the Sedition Act, because it violated Matt Lyons' First Amendment free speech rights. And if a member of Congress doesn't have free political speech, then none of us do. But the court dropped the ball, so to speak. So, the leaders of the Democratic Republican Party, Thomas Jefferson, who's vice president, obviously not getting along with Adams at all by this point, and Congressman Madison, who's the other leader of the party, will react to it. And you can see this explained to you on page 203 in your book. They're going to do so through the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. James Madison will return back to his home state of Virginia and write a resolution for the Virginia state legislature to pass, and Vice President Thomas Jefferson will travel to the brand new state of Kentucky and write a resolution for the Kentucky state legislature to pass. And basically what these two resolutions, the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, state is that if Congress passes a law that is so blatantly unconstitutional that states do not have to enforce it within their state boundaries. Now, so from that point forward, Virginia and Kentucky refused to enforce the Sedition Act. Now, unfortunately, this is a case that 2 wrongs don't make a right. The Sedition Act was unconstitutional, clearly. And so were the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, because there's something in the Constitution known as the Supremacy Clause, which clearly states that federal law is supreme over any state law, and states cannot pass laws contrary to federal law. Kentucky and Virginia resolutions were unconstitutional also. They violated the Supremacy Clause. They're not going to be brought in front of the U.S. Supreme Court. So, this argument will rage on through the rest of Adams' administration, which will roll us around to the election of 1800, which will be a wild and crazy election. Obviously, Thomas Jefferson has time to prepare a campaign, and boy is he. He wants Adams out of there. He wants the Federalists out of there. So if you take a look on page 212 in your book, you have a map showing us the presidential election of 1800. One thing you'll notice from the map also is we have 3 brand new states. Vermont entered the Union in 1791, Matt Lyons state, and also Kentucky and Tennessee are now states in the United States. Now, in this election, remember, the second place finisher is going to be vice president. So both parties are going to run 2 candidates, hoping that their 2 candidates finish first and second. So the Democratic Republicans are going to run, obviously, the rising star and vice president, Thomas Jefferson. Their other candidate is going to be Aaron Burr from the state of New York. President Adams is going to run for re-election, and Thomas Pinckney is going to be the other Federalist candidate who runs. And then, as you'll notice, Federalist John Jay will sort of receive one symbolic electoral college vote. He wasn't running for the presidency, but he was so adored by Americans, especially in the North, one elector cast his vote for John Jay, former Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. Now, you'll notice this election, ended up in a tie between Jefferson and Aaron Burr. Now, when you have a tie in an election, the election gets tossed into the House of Representatives, and it's up to them to determine who is the next president of the United States when you have a tie in the Electoral College and nobody has a clear-cut majority. So, the way it works is the top 3 names are given to Congress. So that means the House of Representatives has to choose between Jefferson, Burr, and Adams. Now, the Democratic Republicans are pretty thrilled about this. They finished first and second, and they instruct all their faithful that obviously we want Thomas Jefferson to be president. So they call Aaron Burr and have a meeting with him, the party leadership. And they basically say to Aaron Burr, "Great job, buddy. You really ran a great campaign. You even defeated Adams. So we want you to back down, throw your support to Thomas Jefferson so he will be elected president. Then you're the second place finisher. You will be vice president." So the Democratic Republicans will control it all. Aaron Burr, who's a pretty egotistical gentleman, basically tells the leadership of the Democratic Republican, "Hey, I tied Jefferson. I'm going to go to the House. Let's see what happens. I think I should be president of the United States." So this creates a very chaotic situation in the House. They are going to have votes where each state casts a ballot for, each state gets one vote, casts a ballot for the person they want to be the next president of the United States between Jefferson, Burr, and Adams. They cast their ballots and no one wins a majority, the votes being split between the 3. And you have to win a majority of the states that exist at the time. So, they'll vote a couple times, no majority. The Democratic Republicans will call Burr in again and say, "Hey, come on, pal. Jefferson's our man, you know it. He created this party. You need to back off." But he won't. The House of Representatives is going to end up voting 36 times before finally Jefferson receives a majority and he's elected president of the United States. but that also means Aaron Burr will be vice president. Now you might think, oh well, at least you got a president and vice president from the same party, unlike the previous administration where you had Adams and Jefferson from opposition parties and the parties hated each other. It was no better. Thomas Jefferson could not stand the sight of Aaron Burr after he put him through all this nonsense in the House of Representatives and wouldn't do the right thing as Democratic Republicans were concerned and back off. So Thomas Jefferson told Aaron Burr, you might as well go back to New York because you are not going to be involved in my cabinet at all. You're vice president, but that doesn't mean you have any power in my administration. Your only purpose is to take over for me if something happens to me. And guess what? I'm a healthy young man. So go back to New York and stay there. I want nothing to do with you. And that's what Aaron Burr has to do. Now, Thomas Jefferson is going to make sure things are changed for the next election that is going to happen in 1804. And he's going to make sure before that election takes place that the Constitution is amended to remedy this nonsense of having presidents and vice presidents who couldn't even stand the sight of each other. So we'll pass the 12th Amendment to the Constitution, which will establish the election system we have today, where presidents and vice presidents run as running mates, not competitors. And that's obviously the system we have today. The original Constitution was flawed. Could you imagine if we hadn't changed the system? Today, Hillary Clinton would be vice president. Wouldn't that be interesting? So, Thomas Jefferson is going to take over as president. He's going to make a pretty significant Inauguration Day speech. But before we talk about that, Adams isn't done as president. Remember, presidents aren't sworn in until March. So, Adams is still in office. Congress in January of 1801 passes the Judiciary Act of 1801. The last time they passed a Judiciary Act was 1789, the very first Congress, when they organized the court system. They needed to update the court system. The country had grew. Remember, we added 3 states, as I pointed out. Courts were getting overloaded. Plus another glaring flaw with that previous law, and this is really a kind of a flaw in the Constitution, the actual number of Supreme Court justices isn't defined by the Constitution. And when they passed that Judiciary Act of 1789, Congress was kind of flying by the seat of their pants, and they created a Supreme Court with 6 justices. That could ultimately lead to tie decisions. Wasn't an issue in the beginning because they're all Federalists, but now that it become apparent, you got to have an odd number. So they're going to add a Supreme Court justice to bring the number to 7. Later on down the road, the number will come to 9 that we have today. And they're going to add some more district courts, federal district courts. Plus, Washington, D.C. is ready to open. And it needs its own separate court system because it's not a state, it's a district. So they're going to create positions in the court system in D.C. Now, President Adams, after this law is passed, gets to appoint all these new people. There are several openings in the court system. There's a new Supreme Court justice to be appointed. And there's several openings. Now, Adams could have waited and said, I'll let the brand new President Jefferson do this. I'm running out of time. It's already early February. I'm going to be out of here by March. Don't really have time to do this. But obviously, the Federalists and Democratic Republicans were at each other's throats. So on his way out of office, he's going to appoint people to all these positions, these openings in the court system. These appointments become known as the famous midnight appointees, appointed by outgoing lame duck President Adams to all these court positions. Now, the most important of these appointments is who's going to be the next Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, because Jay's stepping down. He's going to appoint our old buddy who we talked about with the XYZ affair, brilliant attorney John Marshall, to be the next Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. He'll be taking over in 1801, and he'll be the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court well into the 1830s, and one of the greatest Chief Justices ever, if not the greatest. Another appointment that seems meaningless at the time will be appointing one of the Justices of the Peace of the District of Columbia. A man by the name of Marbury will receive this appointment. It seems meaningless at the time, but as we'll find out, it's going to turn into a whole nother affair that we'll pick up with the next lecture. So, the next lecture, we'll talk about the very famous landmark decision of the Supreme Court, Marbury versus Madison, and the inaugural address of Thomas Jefferson, and start talking about the Jefferson administration. So I'm going to take another break here, class, and I'll be back shortly to pick up where we left off. See you soon.